So I want to welcome Herman Ibanez, who will be speaking tonight about the energy situation during the freeze and talking a little bit more about purchasing energy, which I don't know if you're like me, but there's a lot of fine print that goes into purchasing energy. So it'll be very illuminating to have someone with experience in that industry share his knowledge with us. So Herman, take it away.
Well, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And so presentation tonight is the Texas winter storm and how to buy electricity. And I just wanted to say that, we've gone through a harrowing week where things went awry. We had no control over, and then it was a gift that kept on giving. Because you not only did we suffer the being uncomfortable with not having power, but then the water went off, and then on top of everything else, some of you had to go through issues with freezing pipes and that kind of stuff, and so it just never ended. And so hopefully I'll be able to tell you a little bit more about what happened, why it happened, and then teach you a little bit about how to buy electricity and what to look for in your current bill and what you have to have ready to buy a new contract if you so choose. So I listened to the Standard on March 3rd, and this is the quote that scared me the most. We were 4 minutes and 37 seconds from going to a complete blackout for the entire ERCOT grid. And essentially, I'll go through what that means, but it was that there was a time on the 15th that things could have gone even more awry than they did. So what is ERCOT? ERCOT is the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas. It is the independent system operator, and it serves 90% of Texas with generation services that covers 26 million electricity customers. This is the part that is very key to what happened. Essentially, the grid works off of a frequency of 60 hertz. And it requires, if those 60 hertz aren't maintained if it starts separating from that 60 hertz, it can only be that way for about 9 minutes. And essentially they were able to fix the system so we'd be back at 60 hertz within 4 minutes. So one of the things they heard over and over during the situation is that ERCOT wasn't connected to the main grid. Well, it's not connected to the national grid, but it does have indirect connections to north, to the Southwest Power Pool, which is Oklahoma, and this part of Texas. And then it has 3 connections to the south to CFE, the Comisión Federal de Electricidad in Mexico. But the total amount of electricity that you can get through those indirect connections, I think is about 1,000 megawatts. And essentially we needed a lot more electricity than just 1,000 megawatts. And ERCOT, what they do, it's a group that is in charge of doing an auction on a daily basis for electricity at different hours throughout the day. And so they collect all the bids from all the generators and designate what the price is going to be for that time. And the things that come into play to come up with that price is the demand, what we want to consume at that particular hour, the temperatures outside, wind conditions, and the efficiency of the plants that are based off of fossil fuels. So I also included two graphs. This one right here shows you the actual grid itself. And so we have the big bold ones are what we did during Governor Perry's time, where we added a super grid and at 750 kilovolts. And that brought a lot of the wind power from the Panhandle and on the west side of Texas into the load centers, which are, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, and Austin. And then the second slide here actually shows you the load zones that we have. And it also points out some of the regulated parts of Texas. And so we have deregulated and regulated parts of Texas. And so regulated part of Texas would be San Antonio, Austin, and then we have these yellow marks that are co-ops and different cooperatives and municipals that they essentially own their own generation. So this next slide, I wanted to show what the legal framework was for ERCOT and what they do. So our governor appoints 3 commissioners for the Public Utility Commission, and they give all the rules to ERCOT that manages the system. And that system includes 560 electricity generators that have all sorts of fuel mixes, the retail electric providers, transmission companies, and all this goes to our homes and our businesses to produce from the electricity that goes from our wires to our homes and all that stuff. So, and this is our fuel mix, and this is key because essentially that tells you what are the sources, what are the fuels that are used to generate our electricity. So we have natural gas at 47%, coal at 12%, nuclear at 4%, wind at 29%, and solar at 5%. And these are installed capacities. Why I want to clarify that is the maximum amount of electricity that can be generated by these sources, especially the intermittent ones, which are considered wind and solar. You can't really control when they are working, but this block here, you have some control over how to turn on and turn off those machines. So in summary, we had, starting on the 15th, we had 48.6 amount of all those installed capacity out of service for all sorts of different things. So one was natural gas. The water vapor and natural gas actually froze. And so gas was not going into certain parts, gas power plant, and therefore they weren't able to generate electricity. We had a nuclear reactor in South Texas that was put offline because they had water pump issues. And then there's a certain amount of the wind resource that actually didn't blow at that time, and essentially wasn't able to service our demand. And our demand was 67,000 megawatts. And that actually is higher than the hottest day in the summer last year. So what happened on February 15th? So that is Sunday night and Monday morning, okay? And so the temperatures got very low in the teens, and essentially the power plants started to disconnect or trip. And like I said, they had issues with natural gas and water issues. And this is all happening near midnight, okay? The demand outstripped generation by 20,000 megawatts. So we had only 56,000 megawatts of power available to service a demand that was 76,000 megawatts. Okay, so some natural gas plants didn't have natural gas to run. I explained that, pipeline natural gas has a bit of vapor, and if you're a scientist or an engineer, that vapor is the difference between higher heating value and lower heating value in terms of natural gas BTUs. Like I told you, one of the nuclear reactors had a water pump issue, so 1,000 megawatts went away there. And the critical time happened between 1:30 and 2:03 a.m. So I told you the frequency is 60 hertz. Well, due to power plants tripping or being disconnected from the grid, the frequency became as low as 59.3 megahertz. And that required ERCOT to be very dictatorial and said, and gave the instructions to the transmission and distribution companies like ERCOT and Encore to start blacking out large amounts of power. And so that's what happened on that day. And so that's when the major blackouts happened throughout the state of Texas. So why did they take so long to restore power, and what about wholesale prices? Well, location to critical services actually designated what if you had power outages or not. So if you were close to hospitals or police stations or food distribution centers, essentially you had the shortest amount of disruptions or no disruptions at all. So Marshall lives right next to a HEB food distribution center, and so she didn't have any power interruptions. And Gina, one of our other colleagues, lived within 2 blocks of a hospital, and so she didn't have any interruptions. So those, if you were lucky, you happened to be in the right place at the right time, you were actually not affected by power. But the rest of us could have been anywhere from 20 hours to 50 hours of power disruption in this area. Second thing, as the temperatures warmed up, some of the issues with natural gas and water issues were corrected. And so essentially by Wednesday, things could have gotten back to normal. But the PUC and ERCOT decided to be extra careful, and they wanted to make sure that all power that was available was on the grid, trying to service the demand that Texas had at the time. And so one of the things they did to do that was to, starting on the 15th, the PUC said, you're going to give a price power at $9,000 a megawatt hour to make sure that everybody that can produce electricity is producing electricity. And this is the only way that I can incentivize for them to do that. The other thing that you see in this graph, which is Houston load zone, which is our zone, is starting on February 13th, prices for electricity, because they were anticipating the storm and temperatures were getting colder, essentially started at 1,000, and this is how they went throughout through the 19th, which is when they finally released the fixed price at $9,000 a megawatt hour. So what happened, essentially what happened was there was, even in the summertime, we don't have $9,000 a megawatt hour for more than 2 to 3 hours. We had $9,000 a megawatt hour for 3 days. And so if you weren't on a fixed price contract, you're going to be paying these kinds of prices for the period of time. And so there's only a certain amount of people that decided to do that. So if you were buying electricity on a variable price contract like Griddy, then you would see this in your bill. Most of the people that actually buy electricity on the wholesale price are commercial and industrial folks, and so they have bigger balance sheets to be able to handle those kinds of bills. So this is the most important sheet of paper that actually compares what happened in 2011 to what happened 2 weeks ago. Essentially, we were forced outage. A forced outage means that they were disconnected from the grid. We only had 14,000 megawatts in 2011. We had 52,000 megawatts disconnected in 2011. And EEA3 is the highest alert that ERCOT can give, and it's the most serious designation that they had. 1 hour before this was called, we only had 1,000 megawatts offline. We had almost 2,500 megawatts within the last hour before they called the critical thing. We had 933 generators out. We had almost 350 generators out in February. And this is, we just talked about the frequency. And so the maximum load shed, which means blackouts, we had only 4,000 in 2011. We had 20,000 megawatts in terms of the differential between generation and demand. And so, and then this is what I talked about, peak loads. And then how many hours did we request a shed in 2011? 7.5. In 2011, it was 70.5 hours. So that's the difference of what went on during this last winter storm. And so one of the things that I heard a couple of times during the coverage was, well, if ERCOT was connected to the national grid, the crisis would have been averted. Well, no way, because the surrounding grids were going through the same things that we were going through. So SPP, which is this Southwest Power Pool, MISO Mid-Atlantic, Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and Mexico, CFE, was also having the same weather patterns. So they were still having, they too were having blackouts and brownouts. They were also experiencing the supply gas issues. And though these two were able to import some electricity, their loads were anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts that they needed to import. And we needed 20,000 megawatts to import to our system to avoid, to be able to fill all the demand that we needed. And so the other one, WEC, which is San Antonio, they had gas supply issues as well. because some of the things that were going on in Colorado, where a lot of the gas was also freezing up as well. So that's what happened during the winter storm. So now we're going to transition to how to shop for electricity. So in order to do that, I want to start off by showing you my electric bill. And so I'm going to show you some key things that you need to know about your electric bill, and which you're going to need to present to your retail provider. So you'll need to know what your meter number is. And so at Pulse Power, which is my provider, the meter number is up here. But if you get electricity from Reliant, that meter number is usually over here somewhere. Okay. Then the energy price. I have a 3-year contract to buy 100% renewable power. So I have, and it's fixed. And so this is the price, the fixed price for grid energy. And this is the premium I'm paying. Oops. The premium I'm paying for 100% renewable power. Then these are the transmission and distribution charges, taxes. And then in my bill, they tell me what the all-in price is. So my all-in price with taxes, distribution, all that stuff means that I pay 10.8 cents per kilowatt hour. And then down here, it tells me when my contract date started and when my contract date ends. And so those are key informational pieces that you need to know about before you start talking to a retail energy provider. So who are the providers? Well, a retail energy provider, or REP, are companies that are licensed by the state of Texas to sell electricity to the customers in deregulated areas. They usually have a PUC number, and that number is listed in all their marketing documents and their bills. So if I go back, the PUC number for my company is right here. So there are hundreds of electricity products, but they usually fit 2 buckets. They're a fixed price product and a variable price product. So the fixed price could be just like me, which I just pay a certain fee for every hour that I consume. Or there's, Reliant, they had a big, promotion that you wouldn't pay for nights and for weekends. And so they can structure these things to make you appear to only pay, different times, but essentially they're taking your annual consumption, figuring out what the price is, and making adjustments for these different products. And if you were on the wholesale price model or variable price model, you wouldn't necessarily get a price per hour, and it would be like gritty. And essentially you would get whatever the wholesale price is at a certain time. And so it varies throughout the day. It varies with seasons, and it varies with polar vortexes that could expect the price. And you would be subject to, if we had prices over the summer that got to the $9,000 per megawatt hour, you would have to pay the equivalent for that. And so the other thing that you have to watch out for is some companies give you the price per energy, including center point charges, and some of them do not. But they usually need, they talk about energy only. And so if we go back to my bill, we're talking about this price right here. This is what they're really usually quoting you. All right, so how do I know if I'm paying too much? Well, first of all, if your REP or your provider is Reliant, and your price for electricity only is anywhere from 13 to 14 cents per kilowatt hour. You're paying default prices and you've never talked to an energy provider and negotiated your price for power. That's default. That's what you get if you don't do anything. And in this area, Reliant is your default electricity provider. So if you're a variable rate, you'll know in February because your price when you were paying, like, let's say $100 of price, your bill in February, as soon as it comes through, it's going to be in the thousands of dollars. So a current fixed price 2 to 3 year contract with the current fuel mix, which is without any asking for renewable power, will range between 5.5 cents and 9.9 cents per kilowatt hour. And the key factors to determine what your rate is your usage, your fuel mix request, and your credit score. And something to also to keep in mind, if you have a fixed price contract, and let's say you decide, I don't want to buy it from Reliant anymore, and I want to buy it from Pulse Power, there are termination fees depending on how much left of the contract that you have. So where can I get pricing information? Well, you can call your current retail energy provider and you can say, what's my price? Or can you do, can we renegotiate my contract and make it my price better? You can go to choose to power to choose, which is the PUC site where it shows all the different electricity products and their prices and their terms and their conditions. And if you speak Spanish, they're supposed to have all that stuff in Spanish as well. Or you can talk to energy brokers like myself and my friend Jay Ferry, who's been doing it for, I think, almost 25 years. And if you want to work with energy brokers, the energy brokers actually get paid by the REPs, and they shouldn't be charging you any money. And some of the things that other services that you can get from an energy broker is, let's say that you are running a business and you want to budget your electricity price. They'll usually give you the service of figuring out what your price is for the whole year and on a monthly basis. So what do you need to provide an REP? So what you need to provide as a customer is your name and address, your social security, your Texas driver's license, your meter number, a selection if you want fuel mix, grid mix fuel or renewables, and the term of the contract. And so what are the REPs going to do? They're going to look at you're going to take your Easy ID, which is your meter number, and they're going to view what your annual usage was for the previous 12 months, usually, or during or via the term of the contract that you want. But usually it's just the annual usage. They're going to run a credit check, and then they're going to determine a rate based off of your fuel choice, the term of your contract, and your credit rating. And so that's really what you need to know to buy electricity. So that's my presentation.
So I did see a question in the chat. Debbie said, I thought that Beaumont and El Paso did better than the rest of us, because if you remember that map Herman showed,
yep,
they're on different grids. They're not part of ERCOT.
Right. So they're on Entergy, and so they were MISO, and they're a regulated utility, so they don't have an option to buy electricity from other providers. They only have one choice, and that is Entergy, and they have rates based off of your your consumption and all the other things that I've just mentioned.
My other question is, apparently I was just looking up that they were both on winterized grids. So both of those grids winterized. And you mentioned that everybody was in the same boat with the cold weather. But would there have been enough from winterized grids to provide electricity to other parts of Texas, which didn't prepare from these eastern and western grids? Or could they only have handled Beaumont and El Paso and not really the whole state?
All right, so I mentioned this during my presentation. So, all right, so essentially we were needing 20,000 megawatts to meet our from what we could generate and what the demand was. So yes, we could have benefited a little bit, but they were having to deal with the same kinds of issues and their loads, so they couldn't meet all our load, okay? And they had issues which they ended up having to import loads from different parts of the eastern grid to meet their loads. So there was no way that anybody could have met our total loads. We could have been benefited a little bit, but not much. We would have still had certain parts of Texas would have had blackouts and brownouts regardless of being connected to the national grid.
Could have made a difference between controlled blackouts versus uncontrolled, maybe? Like Oklahoma had controlled hours on, hours off.
All right, so on that, I learned the answer to this today. So things happened so quickly that ERCOT required the transmission and distribution companies to say, look, you know, CenterPoint had 25% of the load that needed to be curtailed or blacked out, and Encore or Dallas had 38, and so they needed to use their circuit controls to turn off electricity. And so one of the questions that came up is even in the committee meeting is, how come you couldn't use smart meters? Because that's why, one of the reasons why we had them. Well, they said, look, CenterPoint answered this. We don't have the hardware and to do the telemetry work that needed to be done to actually turn off smart meters meter by meter. And things happen so fast. The only thing that we could use was our circuit controls to black out the power that we needed to black out to balance the frequency on the system.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
So they say that you know, I think it was, if it was down below 60 hertz for 9 minutes, that the whole system would go down and it would take a month to get back up.
Yep.
Why is that?
Because essentially you have to re-energize the grid, and you have to do it in a controlled manner. And so they have to re-energize the grid as they're filling demand. And so in order to do, so you're essentially, the term is black starting the grid. And so doing that in a controlled manner requires a little ingenuity and in a longer period of time than just overnight.
About a month. That's a long time.
Well, you know, you're essentially, there's no electricity in your transmission wires. So now you have to start putting electricity into transmission wires, and you have to do it, pairing it with the demand in a certain area. And you had to do that gradually. So
there was a big question in the chat. Marshall was talking about wouldn't it be useful if we were part of either the Western or Eastern grid? But also she asks, how could Texas have avoided this?
All right, well, a couple of things were brought up. Okay, so one was weatherizing, and that meant there's a cost benefit analysis with weatherizing. So yes, you could be able to, put weatherizing could be as simple as putting a roof over a turbine to reinforcing the transmission grid. But if you do that, that actually in the summertime, it will cost you, because you put in these extra things to make sure that the electricity works in the wintertime, but it'll cost you in the summertime because you can't generate as much electricity if you didn't have those weatherization controls in. So number two, we talked about our pipelines. Well, we can insulate our pipelines better, and so therefore we wouldn't have the issues with natural gas freezing in our pipelines, and so that actually affected the generation of the gas plants, and so that was number two. And then the other thing, I mean, and then on the water side, physics is physics, so water freezes, and nuclear power station is the most expensive way to heat up water. And so if you have a pump that doesn't work, and that essentially, and that affects the steam that you need to turn your turbine, and that turbine is outside without a roof, stuff happens. Physics happens. So that's essentially what happened there. So they weren't expecting nuclear to be affected at all. They weren't expecting gas plants to start tripping. They weren't expecting things, there was big chunks of power starting at 11 o'clock at night, starting to trip and disconnect from the grid. And so these were big chunks, like 900 megawatts, 800 megawatts, and then 3,000 megawatts happened in the hour before 1:30, and that's when, and then the frequency issue happened. So things just happened. And that the second thing that I think could have happened that would affect the prices were that you could have, the PUC was overly cautious and set the price of $9,000 a megawatt hour for a lot longer than they needed to do so. So I think by Wednesday morning, they could have gone to regular order and reinstated the bidding process. But they were being overly cautious and wanted to make sure that all the electricity that was available to be on the grid was generating. And so that was the only market mechanism that they had to try to ensure that. So the audit, the PUC had FERC audit them, and they said, we paid over $16 billion over what we should have. That's why, the freezing of that price at 9,000 megawatts for, an extra day or two. That's how that amount of money was accumulated.
So German, we have a discussion back and forth on emails. I understand that, thank you for explaining a lot of the in-depth, technical and also other logistic things. But the bottom line that we should really think about is whether this such a regulation makes any sense or not. Because if we look back, essentially Texas had lost the power for all of those hours, and so many people have, lost their houses because of the, the pipeline and all of the stuff. We all suffered during that week, but in turn, they're charging $50 billion electricity and 16 billion is overcharged. And it just doesn't make any sense at all. And to me,
So-
why should they give, I understand the market incentive, but charging $9,000 megawatts an hour, that's just, to me, this is people profiting from this crisis. And that crisis was artificially made in scarcity. And I sent you guys an email. It's an article on Daily Coup. I can send you again because this disaster was repeated. For example, how Enron played the game in California's blackout and how they profit out of that. So seriously, I hope Texas will learn the lesson from this, because there's no way how our nation can regulate electricity and very fundamental public utility in such a way.
All right, so I have an answer to that. Okay, so one, like I said, they were being overly cautious. Number two, this is torque law. So, essentially they have rules, and they say if the price is $9,000 a megawatt hour, you have an obligation to the generators to pay that price. Okay, so, and they came up, and PUC came up with that price by doing an economic study on, what, the cost benefit analysis of having electricity and those effects. And so I agree that what could happen was, in this next time, could be one of a couple of things. This $16 billion could show up on your electric bill as a charge in the T&D charge, and over, Texas is going to issue a bond, and they're going to finance that that overcharge that way. Number two, this may require the PUC to say, well, $9,000 a megawatt hour for this time wasn't right. Maybe $4,500 is the right price for this. And so that'll make that the top price because of what happened this time around. And then according to the committee meeting, the PUC said they didn't think that they had the right to obligate generators to weatherize their machines, because the utilities are not the only ones that own generation. There's independent power producers that have invested money and can put in a generation wherever they can find land and transmission to put it in the state. And so it's not concentrated, the ownership of the generation is not concentrated in one hand like it is in a regulated system like Entergy. Entergy, they own most of the power, and you can only auto generate electricity and service your own load here. And then the other, lots of wind and solar have private power purchase agreements with the Amazons and other people in the world that want electricity at a cheap price from here and are willing to wield power or do a virtual power purchase agreement to get the power from Texas, which is the cheapest power in the United States.
So just
Would it be correct to say that the $9,000 a kilowatt hour pricing system failed us, that we did not get what we thought we were going to get from that?
Plus, we have to pay a lot more.
The answer is possibly.
Okay.
The issue was the ERCOT and PUC never thought that they were going to have $9,000 a megawatt hour for 3 days running. The most they thought they were going to have to pay for that was 1 to 4 hours. So I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Herman. And thank you everyone for your questions. This has been really fascinating discussion.